Thank you all for being here today. My name is Haley Platt. I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at Siembra Mobile. And one of the objectives that I wanted to have in these conversations surrounding college access obviously is impacted by universities and professors, and of course, students and families sit at the center of that. So, Reimagining College Access series. In the second season, we're going to focus a little bit more on how institutions are dealing with some of the pressures and uh, problems that are facing higher education today. And I'm joined by two panelists today. We're going to start off with Dr. Robert Kelchen. So welcome. He is a nationally recognized scholar and professor from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So welcome. Do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I'm Robert Kelchen. I'm a professor of higher education and a department head at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And in addition to running a department, I study higher ed finance, accountability, and student financial aid.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to get the conversation started. You probably recognize Dr. Kelchen from all of his news articles. I certainly read them and get them in my inbox every week. So honored to have him on. And second, I have Dr. Stephanie Niles, who is the president of Cotty College. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here. As Haley said, I am the president of Cotty College, a small women's college in Southwest Missouri. I've been president there for just over 4 years. Prior to that, I spent 25 years in college enrollment, financial aid, marketing, and communications. And so, as a longtime chief enrollment officer and as a current college president, certainly the issues that we'll talk about today are ones I'm quite familiar with and eager to have this discussion.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I know a lot of conversations going on right now talk about the challenges that universities are facing today, the landscape of higher education, but I want to focus more so on the solutions and effective strategies that universities are implementing to adapt, and what we see for the future of higher education. So, the overall question that I came up with for today is just what are institutions doing right now that is helping them adapt, collaborate more effectively, and better support students despite increasing economic or financial pressures. So I think we'll kick off, Dr. Kelchen, I'd love to have you set the stage for us. Just kind of briefly, what is going on in higher education? Some of the buzzwords that we're hearing are the demographic cliff and increased mergers and acquisitions and college closures. So if you could just set the scene for some of our listeners who might not be familiar with this right now.
Sure. And if I could put the term demographic cliff out to pasture, I would. It's not the best term for what we're going through. What we're going through is the number of high school graduates nationwide peaked probably in the last year or two, and it's going to be on a steady decline over the next 17 to 18 years, as far out as we can predict at this point. Now, this has been happening longer in the Northeast and Midwest, but it's not like we wake up tomorrow and there are 15% fewer high school graduates. It's a slow, steady decline over time. We've also seen a decline in the share of high school graduates going directly on to college, and that started before the pandemic, and it's down about 7 or 8 percentage points, so that's pretty substantial. And we've had fewer adult learners come back to college, driven more by a strong to steady economy over the last 10 years. So all those factors have really put pressures on colleges' budgets. At the same time, they've had to deal with things like rising health insurance costs, inflation, and tuition revenue that often is not going up as fast as their operating costs. And that does get to questions of mergers, acquisitions, and closures. I mean, there are predictions that half of all colleges will close in the next 10 years. That is likely to not happen. But we have seen an uptick in the number of private nonprofit colleges closing, but out of a base of something around 2,000 colleges, the most we've seen close in a single year is 17. The long-term average is 6. And so far this year, we have 8 announced. It's not a mass extinction event, in part because colleges are pursuing mergers and acquisitions, although that can often be difficult to do. And also, colleges are being serious about cutting costs. They're making painful decisions about doing things like ending academic programs, not filling vacant positions, and just questioning every expenditure. And those are difficult conversations to have, but I think that'll help keep the number of closures lower than what a lot of people think.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think also adding on, it's not just one specific type of school that's feeling the impact. It's across the board. You're seeing, cuts to federal grants and research. You're seeing departments, so there's a lot of challenges going on, but it's not just the small colleges that are getting hit. Dr. Niles, as a small college, where are you seeing it? And you might have, your own smaller community of presidents who discuss this probably on a regular basis. But I'd love to have you weigh in on some of the other challenges before we get into the opportunities.
Well, I think Robert really hit the nail on the head of what those challenges are that we are facing. Certainly the shifting demographics or the decrease in high school enrollment. Just even this last week and some of the decisions that have been made by the current administration around international students and the length of time they're to remain in the country regarding their educational program, that's going to pose a whole new set of challenges for that really critically important population for students. And we've already seen that population impacted in the last couple of years, and this will add a new layer of complication at a time when institutions are already struggling. Rising costs, certainly, all the time I'm hearing from my vice president for enrollment, but from team members, from faculty members who are in conversations with students about the ways that students and their families are being challenged by the increasing costs that they face every year. And as I do have those conversations with colleagues, that certainly continues to resonate as something that many are seeing and facing. And there was an article just a few weeks ago about the number of institutions that have crossed the $100,000 threshold for their comprehensive costs. So these issues seem to be proliferating, and it's a difficult environment for students to navigate, particularly because they're also seeing so many messages that are causing them to question the value of a college degree and if it will be truly beneficial to their futures.
I'm happy you brought that up because I do think part of what, Siembra is trying to do is show students the different pathways that are out there. And some of those, depending on where you live, are very non-traditional. And so, whereas community college system in California, for example, is really huge, as someone who grew up in the Northeast, that never came across my desk as an option. And I think a lot of students and institutions need to adapt how they see higher education in order for the current system to work for them. And so that kind of gets us into the opportunities. What are some opportunities that you've been seeing on a wider scale? And how is your own institutions and maybe others that are similar to you adapting those? So, Dr. Niles, or if you want to start on that.
One thing I was going to reiterate, Haley, something that you mentioned, just the fact that there are so many options for students. And I think that the point that you made about students considering the range of opportunities available to them, to not just think college should look one way, be one way, the experience should be the same for each student. But there are many different ways to obtain a collegiate degree. There are different venues and forums and sizes of institutions and hybrid and online and in-person approaches. And so I do think that students being willing to think outside the box when it comes to college and determining if there's something that's right for them that will enable them to acquire the education they need to do what they want to do. But it may not look exactly what it looked like for older siblings, parents, or others.
Right. And I'm glad you said that too, as I always emphasize, what might have worked for your older sibling might not work for you. Same thing with parents. There's a huge difference with a first generation student who is considering what does college mean when they're looking at the college, uh, programs, the cost, everything that goes into attending college. And I think on the flip side, then you have parents who maybe have gone to college and it was a completely different experience. They talk about all the fun they had and, their experience of like a traditional college that you would see in a movie. And I don't think that that's comparable to what it is now just because of the way that our world works. And so I want to make sure that when we're talking with students, we're presenting every pathway and giving them that early exposure so that they know about the range of possibilities. But it also ties into the college and career readiness of, is this something that you actually need to pursue based on what you want to do? And how can we, as educators and supporters of learners, make it a choice that doesn't have so much friction or it doesn't have so much nuance. So I think those are all really great points. Dr. Kelchen, if you have some to add.
Sure, colleges have done a lot to become more flexible to students over the past 20 years. And I think two of the first big efforts we saw were pushes to go online and pushes to start more graduate programs from four-year institutions. Because those are two markets where there was some need for them, and also colleges thought they could make some money to help subsidize the rest of their programs that way. Those are challenging markets to get into. The biggest institutions can still do some more of those things, but if you're relying on graduate programs to keep you afloat, there is just a new set of graduate school loan limits that got put in place that makes that more difficult. But another example of innovation that's existing in part outside of what the government is expecting is accelerated degree programs. We've had this idea of competency-based education for about 15 or 20 years now, where students can effectively show they've learned the material, test out, and not have to sit through a full course. And then on top of that, we're seeing institutions moving to reduced credit bachelor's degrees in particular, a 3-year degree potentially. Those are just getting started, but accreditors are very interested, states are very interested, institutions are interested. And if we can find a way to deliver those programs with value, even if it's not quite the value of a traditional credential, it gets students back out in the labor market earlier, and that can attract potentially a broader group of students.
I think
I love
the
that you
question that's
said
really,
that.
oh, sorry to
Yeah,
jump
no,
in, Haley,
please,
but I think
please.
the question that's really important is for each institution to consider what's right for them. What can they do that will allow them to perhaps reach more students, but is in alignment with their mission? This question talks about institutions adapting in different ways, and I think that's so key. As Robert said, larger institutions, there's more room, there's more ability to do more. My institution, as a very small women's college, is not going to respond to the environment in which we sit in the way that the regional public down the road will respond, because we have different strengths, we have different capacities, and we have different needs. And so I think that's really critical for an institution not to just look at any other institution, but look both at external data, but internally. What can you do as an institution that truly capitalize on your strengths that meets needs of our students today?
I completely agree. And I think part of the reason why it's hard to approach these types of conversations is that one college can't just go and replicate what another college is doing in order to pull them out of, whatever is going on in their challenges. And I think having the opportunity to talk about what's working is great, but the institution really has to turn towards what is working for them and what has worked in the past. And this kind of ties into my next question, but um, the implementation of it, are colleges considering their community and their student population when they're making these decisions? I see a lot of students who say, I'm first gen and I was part of the first gen club at XYZ school, but it didn't feel like they had any of us involved in the conversation when they were planning out what they were doing to support us in the program. So I think it's super important to involve, the local community and see how it's impacting on a broader sense. But some of the most promising strategies, I can just start off with a specific example that I really admire, is all the colleges that have either partnered with local high schools to get that dual enrollment or as a feeder. or alternatively on the back end, colleges partnering with local companies to kind of redevelop some of their majors or pathways into jobs that they can actually graduate and go directly to that company with the skill sets needed to perform and be a part of that company and be an effective hire essentially. So that's just my favorite example from this question. But if either of you want to jump in and start on this.
I'm happy to go ahead and start. I know I wrote an article that was in the Chronicle a couple months ago that just touched on a handful of opportunities that institutions could consider capitalizing on to determine what strategies might be useful to them. And I talked about new academic programs, which we touched on a little bit earlier. You know, what are those academic programs that meet the demand of the public that the institution's looking to serve? And does it align with institutional mission? Those are certainly critical questions to ask before looking at investing in those areas. New athletic programs is another strategy that institutions have tried. Again, really important to ask whether or not you have the market to reach out and attract students, given that there will be upfront investments needed when new athletic programs are added. But that's been, I would say, a long time strategy that institutions have utilized in order to enhance enrollment. Marketing and recruitment strategies. Are you capitalizing on all markets, on all tools, on all ways in which you can bring your message to new and different populations of students that may have some resemblance to those where you've seen traction and you've seen success in communicating the value and mission of your institution? And then also thinking about new student audiences, which we've talked a little bit about here as well. But my institution, for example, is looking at introducing online programs. We have not, as a women's college, many other women's colleges have offered online programs, graduate programs, or programs for non-traditional aged women. My institution has not done that. And that's something because we have a long-time affiliation with a very large women's organization in the country that would allow us through that organization to market these programs effectively. That's a niche, but it's one that we've been able to identify where we might be able to gain some traction. Programs that have a particular appeal to women who would be looking to continue perhaps a lapsed educational experience, and to do so online as they're dealing with other responsibilities or challenges that they're facing that may not allow them to relocate and take part in a traditional residential experience. But that was thinking about our particular mission, opportunities that we could deliver on, resources that we hadn't fully capitalized on, that we felt we could potentially see some benefit from. So I think those are a few examples of some of the strategies and approaches that institutions could take, and certainly one that may prove fruitful for my institution.
Well, it's great to hear. And as a smaller school and as a niche school, just a follow-up question for you on that. What advice would you give to other schools who might be saying, well, I don't know whether to pull the trigger on this specific program or whatnot because I don't have any way to evaluate whether it's going to work ahead of time. So what would
Sure.
you say are the biggest factors in terms of how your team is looking at whether to implement something or not? It might just boil down to finances or staff capacity, but even if that's not the case, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, when we have asked ourselves some of these really difficult questions, we've also done an academic prioritization process where we did eliminate a handful of minors. Now we have a smaller number of majors because Cotty College only became a four-year institution about 15 years ago. So we were looking at the entirety of our program, but thought that some of our longer term minors and our associate degrees were proving to yield less in terms of enrollment and graduates for the institution. But we did that research. We partnered with a third-party provider that brought some tools to our faculty to allow us to engage in an examination of our own programs, our own enrollment data specific to the institution, but also the entirety of each major and each course. And then we also were able to look at external data as well. What was the labor market demanding? in the local area, the region, the nation, how were we best preparing our students for what those demands were? What were the skill sets we needed to be developing? And so utilizing that data was a really important step. We did not just make these decisions in a vacuum. The other thing we did when I talked about this online set of online degrees that we're introducing, we've partnered with a consortium. So it actually has reduced our upfront cost quite a bit in that the way in which these courses are being delivered is shared. So no one entity is responsible for all the marketing and promotion or all the delivery of of the material or all the design of that material. So that has, again, thinking a little bit outside the box, looking for a different way to approach problem that's perhaps not new, has allowed us to be more cost conscious in the delivery of this program.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's great insight. And Dr. Kelchen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this from a broader perspective, and then also maybe what's going on at the University of Tennessee.
So at the University of Tennessee, we're working on a big investment into online education because most students who attend online institutions are actually located fairly close to that institution. And we have the better part of 1 million Tennesseans who have some college and no degree. And we have a different situation than a lot of higher ed. We just do not have capacity for more in-person students. And even if we did, if students are living an hour and a half away, they're not going to be able to drop their lives, come here for in-person programs. So that's where targeted online degrees really have value, but it's also easier when you have a big name behind it. And you don't have to spend as much on marketing because people recognize your name from football Saturdays. And I think more broadly, the growth of coalitions in higher ed, I think, has been really valuable. We've seen several over the course of the last decade. Two that really stick out to me are the University Innovation Alliance, which I think it now is getting close to 20 big public universities, and they have done a lot to focus on student success. And then one that really flies under the radar, but it's been around since the early 2010s, is the Yes We Must Coalition, which is small private colleges, mainly in rural areas, serving a lot of Pell students. And they've been able to network, share strategies about academic programs, about finding cost savings. And those are the sorts of things that can help institutions survive and thrive during difficult times.
Yeah, that's great. I think coalitions and having schools working together to, I think, even redefine what student success is in this new age is super important. And something that I think has come up a lot throughout the conversation that I want to kind of zone in on is the difference between career readiness and career literacy. And I think the career literacy piece, where it's different from career readiness, it's not just preparing a student, but it's helping them understand their strengths, explore different career pathways, and make informed decisions about their career. So it's taking it, I think, a step farther than a typical career exploration path where a student might be aware of what careers are out there, but I think it doesn't necessarily bridge, how do I fit into the job market? Because I think it leaves a big gap. And so I'm curious what you're seeing with your own students. What are they voicing, as they're coming into college and as they're leaving as a strength that they've gained um, since, graduating, or benefits of higher education. I know we all see the value, but it's, portrait of a graduate, educating the whole person is kind of the big topics in high school, but I'm kind of curious how you guys see it from the college side of how are we preparing our graduates and what are we actually hearing from them in terms of readiness. So
Well, I'm a big believer in the power of internships. I think the practical hands-on opportunities that they provide can be truly instrumental as students are making their way out into a really challenging job market. Certainly an internship, even a week or two, a semester, a summer, those offer different experiences, but the chance to ask yourself is this the right field for me? Is what I'm observing, are the conversations I'm having with folks in this particular industry, do they resonate with me? Do they align with my interests? Do I think that I can see myself in this field? Two, diving in to gaining some practical experience, to making connections, professional connections that could lead down another pathway. I remember a student from not my current institution, but a former one who did an internship almost every year through a semester program, through online experiences, through summer opportunities. And she continued to hone in on the exact industry and even the exact company for which she wanted to work, starting with a really broad idea. But those experiences, coupled with the skills she was developing through her classroom-based work, really enabled her to say, this is where I want to work. I know it's what I want to do. I know that I can contribute to it in these ways, and it will produce the outcomes for me and my ability to contribute to society in the ways that I'm looking for. So I think any ways that we can empower students to put their classroom-based skills to use in practical settings, to develop networks and connections while they're in college, is really empowering for the student as they're making their way out into industry.
Yes, I completely agree. Dr. Kelchen, I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add is that long-standing tension between preparing students for their first job versus preparing students for a career. And students often come in very focused on that first job. And it's our job within higher education to prepare them for more than just that first job. Otherwise, your career opportunities are pretty limited, especially in a world where those entry-level white-collar jobs are very much at risk.
Yeah.
And I mean, the students who started college 2 to 4 years ago, they started in a completely different environment, a completely different labor market. And that means that students, faculty, staff, administrators, everyone is trying to adjust on the fly to figure out what do we do in a world where the labor market is interesting to say the least, and nobody's quite sure what AI will end up meaning for the broader economy.
When I was a chief enrollment officer at another institution, the provost of that institution used to give a talk to our prospective and admitted student groups. And he would say, now I read a recent study that indicated by the time an individual is 40 years old, they will have X number of jobs. And he'd ask them to guess how many that would be. And this information may be a little dated. It's probably been 11 or 12 years since the last time I heard him give this talk, but it was at that time 13 jobs that one has by the time they're 40. Not necessarily with all different companies. It may be progression within a certain company. But I remember sitting back the first time and thinking, well, what's my number? And realizing it was 11. So I was pretty close to the average. But I think to Robert's point, that's really critical, is that students are not just thinking about that first job, but even in a short time period, their ability to progress, their ability to offer their expertise, to gain more expertise, and then to share it in new and different ways, to adapt as the industry or career path they've chosen has continued to adapt to a changing environment, will be really critical for them to be thinking about, not just, as you said, what's that first job, but how do I continue to adapt as industry changes around me?
Yes, and I think as someone who is Gen Z myself, I think it's easy to get caught up in the looming doom of, what does this mean for us, and how can my skill set, how will it be applied in 10 years? And I think you hit the nail on the head, is that we continuously have to adopt. And I know my parents were graduating in the 90s when it was the dot-com boom, and they were probably saying the exact same thing. And so I think just kind of putting into perspective and narrowing it down, especially for the high school students that I talk with who come to me and say, I have no idea what I want to do. And I'm like, back up. You don't have to know that right now, but go ask your family and your friends and your coaches and your teachers and any other mentors that you might have. What are my best qualities that I bring, what makes me unique, and do some self-reflecting of what subjects am I interested in, and where do I feel like myself in the classroom? And is it that with peer groups where I'm interacting with my classmates? Is that when I'm like listening to a lecture? And I kind of ask students to take it one step at a time and put in perspective, you know, how can we make sure that you're following a long-term path and you can see into the future without necessarily knowing what specific job that's going to get you to. So I think we can move on to the next question. I know many of the solutions require collaboration between the enrollment, finance, student success, academic affairs, all of the departments that make up a college. And some schools might have 20 people on a team and some schools might have two. But what does effective cross-campus collaboration actually look like in practice? Dr. Kelchen, you want to start?
Sure, it's getting all the decision makers together in a room and also making sure that you have the right people in the room identified as decision makers. So, for example, finance historically wasn't always part of the conversation. They were seen more as the compliance people to make sure that you don't get shut down due to a poor audit. But now that finance is key, chief financial officers are in that room more. Or people leading student success efforts maybe weren't there a while ago. It was strictly, say, the provost doing that sort of work. So it's figuring out who are the people who need to be there, getting them in the room, and giving them the agency to have that conversation.
I agree. I think we talk a lot about silos in higher education, and the elimination of those silos is really what produces effective change. That collaborating, I agree with everything that was said, thinking about the inclusion of finance, particularly as a former chief enrollment officer. I was always very much engaged with the vice president for finance at my institution because we had to collaborate on our shared goals. I couldn't just say, well, I can bring in this many students if our goal institutionally was to bring in more in order to achieve the necessary operating budget to sustain our experience. And so it really works both ways. But students don't just come to an institution because you entice them to enroll. They come for academic programs. They come to study with faculty members. They come to engage in co-curricular opportunities that will broaden their perspectives. And so including those individuals in the room to ensure that they are part of the conversation, that they're understanding what students are seeking, that we're offering value within those experiences. I think that the entirety of the set of individuals that you've named here is really critical to be part of those conversations.
Thank you. Yeah. And that kind of ties into the next question of what's one common misconception about higher education finance, enrollment, or institutional sustainability that you wish more people understood? I know this
One
is one.
example I was perhaps going to provide was sustainability can sometimes be seen as just a function of enrollment, right? And we know that every institution typically depends on a small number of revenue sources, right? Typically it's in, the three-legged stool: enrollment, endowment, and fundraising. But I know that enrollment does get a lot of attention because it is so fluid for every institution, whereas the others can certainly be fluid, but oftentimes are a bit more stable. When I arrived at my institution at Cotty, which is very small, residential capacity of 350 students, it was designed to be an intentionally small community to serve students in a particular way. But when I got here, people were talking about we need to be 500. We need to be 500 students. And I couldn't figure out why. 500 seemed to be the magic number because, frankly, 500 students, given that we were created for 350, introduced a set of additional costs and potential investments that would actually detract from the revenues we would have generated from enrolling those additional students. So the actual number is quite a bit smaller than that. And it depends not just on enrolling that number of students, but that they're also bringing with them a certain amount of revenue. So but to get to that, we really drilled into what that number should be, why it should be that number, what were the other factors that were influencing the determination of that number, and then, of course, how could it be achieved?
Yeah.
So I would add that the perception is that the sky is falling, countless colleges are going to close, and at the same time, there are serious concerns facing institutional finances. But institutions are more responsive than both they used to be and the public perception. So I think that there are a lot of colleges that will find a way to continue to operate. They may be struggling, but college closures are not as widespread as people think they are, and they're not going to be as widespread as people think they are, even if the rate of closure does end up ticking up.
Yeah, I think the conversations about higher education, and it just feels like this impending doom, like you said, like the sky is falling. And I think putting it into perspective, when you compare how many schools actually are making strides in the right direction and are adapting to better serve their student population, and what you said in the beginning, Dr. Niles, accurate, representing their mission in a way that is authentic to what they've done and authentic to the students who want to go there and want to be a part of that community. And we're seeing more and more students who, still have the desire to either go to a small college, go to a big school, but the ways in which they're engaging with the college might be changing. And I think that early outreach, and the students want to feel that you care about them. And so that's part of what I think is, at least in the marketing side of higher education, is something that I wish more people understood, is the Gen Z's just wants to be understood. They just want to feel seen amidst a mass population.
Robert made a comment at the beginning of our conversation where he said that mergers and acquisitions are becoming more common and cutting costs. And institutions are engaged more in cutting costs, which are leading to more opportunities for institutions to find their way in a difficult financial environment. Having been at the Council of Independent Colleges President's Institute for the last 4 years, even in that short time period, I feel like I've observed a bit of a shift between individuals who, mergers and acquisitions was, if there was a session on that topic, you might want to sneak into the back of the room, but really didn't want to be seen engaging. And almost, it seems like even in that time period, that conversation is becoming more commonplace. Institutions are differently willing to engage because it is a reality of the situation we're in that we may not need every institution to deliver the experience as it has for however many years it's been in existence, but partnering with another can allow it to persist, albeit in different form or fashion, but can allow it to persist and perhaps even have a greater impact on a different set of students by joining forces with another. So I'm not saying that everybody's raising their hand to ask, can I merge with another? But I do think that there is a more realistic vision on the part of college and university leaders that that's not necessarily always a negative, but could
Mhm.
lead to really positive outcomes in this challenging environment.
Yeah. And I could focus a whole other webinar session on how direct admissions and K-12 TK-12 partnerships are benefiting colleges in a similar way. But I will save that for another time. Our last question is, as you look onward towards the future of higher education, what gives you the most optimism?
I would say it's the people, that there is nothing better than just going into a classroom and teaching students, or meeting that student that you're just working with one-on-one on Zoom, or in my position as department head, just working with my faculty and staff. The people in this industry are amazing. And that makes me optimistic, not just for higher education, but for where we can go in this country.
I was going to cite an example that's very much along those same lines. A young woman who graduated from my institution just this past May came to Cotty from a very small farming community in Nebraska. First generation college student. Nobody in her family, extended family, had attended college, just wasn't even talked about. Yet she was able to connect with a counselor who advised her in this direction, and she just blossomed as a student at the institution. We take our students in their sophomore or junior year on an international experience. And doing that really opened her eyes. She'd never been out of the country, never thought to get a passport before coming. And suddenly her worldwide perspective was changed. And she is now going to graduate school in Scotland in the fall. And she said 4 years ago, that same young woman who crossed the threshold at Takati would never have thought like that. And we've all interacted with students like that, students who are just transformed because of interaction with a faculty member, a particular experience they've had, knowledge that they've gained through materials taught to them in the classroom. Just education's transformative, and there are anecdotes that anyone working in this space can cite that are leading to these tremendous outcomes for young people.
I love that we ended on such a heartfelt note. I come from a very long line of educators and administrators and teachers, and I always have an appreciation for them. But I think, especially working directly, alongside them in my everyday, it's amazing to hear these stories. And I think all of us can cite a teacher that has made an impact on us. So I'm glad you are both experiencing the same with your current students. But that brings us to the end. Is there anything else you guys want to add? I think we pretty much covered a lot,
No, I
though.
appreciate the opportunity to be a part of what's such an important discussion, and certainly would always look forward to engaging with individuals as they. I do think it's a small community, and we are all experiencing so many of the same challenges. And so, talking with others, hearing what they're doing in their environment might give you a kernel of an idea that could help in your own. So, I think these conversations are really valuable and important to continue to foster. So, I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and to having this conversation for those who are listening.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Kelchen, do you have anything?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, well, thank you both so much for being on. I've really enjoyed talking about all of this, and I think it's important, especially for people who are maybe unsure or feeling a little bit pessimistic about the future. I think a lot of things can be blown out of proportion when talking about it. So I think it's good to center ourselves in what's actually working, and some optimism. So thank you both for joining. That brings us to the end. If you haven't checked out Siembra Mobile, we are a ed tech based out of Stanford's Graduate School of Education. Our website and my email is linked at the bottom, and this will be uploaded to YouTube, so that's probably where you're going to be watching this from. Thank you so much for joining, and feel free to check out other videos on our series. Bye, thanks.